The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Queen Camilla walked briskly through the grand corridors, her heels clicking against the polished stone with each determined step. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on her shoulders, and the carefully maintained composure that had served her well through decades of public scrutiny was beginning to crack under the strain. Captain James Morrison of the Royal Guard stood at attention near the entrance to the king's private study, his uniform immaculate and his posture rigid with years of military training. At 35, Morrison had served the crown for over a decade, earning his position through unwavering loyalty and an unblemished record of service. His dark eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but he was acutely aware of every movement in the palace corridors, every whispered conversation between staff members, and every subtle shift in the atmosphere that had been building for weeks. The tension had been mounting ever since the latest scandal broke in the tabloids 3 weeks prior. Photos had surfaced showing a member of the royal household in compromising positions, and, while the palace had issued stern denials and threats of legal action, the damage to the monarchy's carefully crafted image was significant. The king had been working tirelessly with his advisors to contain the fallout, but Queen Camilla had taken the attacks particularly hard, viewing them as a direct assault on the legitimacy she had fought so hard to establish. Morrison had noticed the change in her demeanor during his daily security briefings. Where once she had been gracious and warm to the staff, now there was a sharp edge to her interactions, a barely contained frustration that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The other guards had begun to whisper among themselves about her increasingly volatile moods, but Morrison maintained his professional silence, understanding that discretion was perhaps the most valuable quality a royal guard could possess. On this particular morning, however, something was different. The Queen's usual retinue of ladies-in-waiting was notably absent, and she moved through the palace with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. Morrison had received word earlier that morning that she had requested a private audience with the king, unusual given their normal pattern of scheduled meetings and formal protocols. As Queen Camilla approached the study doors, Morrison stepped forward to perform his customary security check and announcement of her arrival. The protocol was simple but important. Even family members of the royal household were required to be properly announced before entering the king's private chambers. Morrison had performed this duty hundreds of times before, but as he moved to intercept the Queen's path, he noticed something in her expression that gave him pause. Her eyes held a fire that he had never seen before, and her jaw was set in a way that suggested she was prepared for confrontation rather than conversation. The Queen's hands were clenched at her sides, and Morrison could see the slight tremor that betrayed the intensity of whatever emotion she was struggling to contain. Years of training had taught him to read body language and assess potential threats, and while Queen Camilla certainly posed no physical danger to the king, Morrison sensed that this encounter might prove volatile in ways that could damage the monarchy itself. "Your Majesty," Morrison said respectfully, stepping into her path with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing delicate situations, "His Majesty is currently in conference with the Prime Minister's office. Perhaps I could arrange for you to meet with him after." The words were barely out of his mouth when Queen Camilla's hand moved with surprising speed. The slap connected with Morrison's left cheek with enough force to turn his head slightly to the right, the sharp crack echoing through the marble corridor like a gunshot. The sound seemed to hang in the air for an eternal moment, followed by a silence so complete that Morrison could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. For Captain James Morrison, the world seemed to slow down in that instant. His cheek stung from the impact, but more than the physical pain was the shock of the unprecedented breach of protocol. In all his years of service, through countless tense situations and high-pressure moments, nothing had prepared him for this. Members of the royal family simply did not strike their guards. The very idea was so far outside the bounds of acceptable behavior that Morrison found himself temporarily paralyzed, unsure of how to respond to a situation that had no precedent in all his training. Queen Camilla's face was flushed with anger and what might have been immediate regret, but her eyes still burned with the same intensity that had driven her to this moment. She stood there, breathing heavily, her hands still raised slightly as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just done. The weight of her action seemed to settle over both of them like a heavy blanket, and Morrison could see the exact moment when the full implications of what had occurred began to dawn on her. Behind the closed doors of the study, King Charles had been reviewing a stack of briefing papers when the sound of the slap reached his ears. The sharp crack was unmistakable, and it was followed by a quality of silence that immediately put him on alert. Years of marriage to Camilla had taught him to recognize the particular timbre of her anger, and the absence of any subsequent conversation or movement in the corridor told him that something significant had just occurred. Morrison remained frozen in position, his military training warring with his human instincts. Protocol dictated that he should immediately report any assault on a member of the Royal Guard, but the unique circumstances of this situation made such a response potentially catastrophic for all involved. The Queen's action could be seen as a criminal assault, but pursuing such charges would create a scandal that would dwarf any previous controversy faced by the monarchy. As he stood there, feeling the sting in his cheek begin to fade, Morrison found himself thinking not about his own dignity or rights, but about the institution he had sworn to protect. The crown was larger than any individual, including himself, and his duty extended beyond personal grievances to the preservation of the monarchy itself. The calculation was swift but thorough. Exposing this incident would serve no one and would likely cause irreparable damage to the very institution he had dedicated his life to serving. Queen Camilla seemed to recognize the gravity of what had occurred, and Morrison could see her struggling with her own internal battle between pride and pragmatism. The anger that had driven her to strike him was still evident in her posture, but it was now mixed with something that looked very much like fear. Not fear of physical retaliation, Morrison would never raise a hand to a member of the royal family, but fear of the consequences that such an unprecedented breach of protocol might bring. The corridor remained eerily quiet, with none of the usual bustle of palace staff going about their duties. Morrison realized that they were, for the moment, alone in this section of the palace, which was perhaps fortunate given the need to contain this situation before it could spiral out of control. The longer they stood there in silence, however, the more awkward and potentially dangerous the moment became. Morrison made his decision with the same quick thinking and loyalty that had earned him his position. Drawing upon reserves of dignity and professionalism that ran deeper than personal affront, he straightened his shoulders and looked directly into Queen Camilla's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was steady and respectful, betraying none of the shock or anger he might have been feeling. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "shall I announce your arrival to His Majesty?" The simple question served multiple purposes. It acknowledged what had occurred without dwelling on it, offered Queen Camilla a path forward that preserved her dignity, and demonstrated Morrison's continued loyalty despite the unprecedented assault. More importantly, it signaled his understanding that this incident would go no further, that his discretion could be counted upon absolutely. Queen Camilla's expression shifted slightly, and Morrison caught a glimpse of something that might have been gratitude mixed with her ongoing anger. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding and the weight of shared knowledge that could never be revealed. Finally, she gave a slight nod, and Morrison could see some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "please do." Morrison turned toward the study doors, his movements deliberate and professional. As he reached for the handle, he could hear Queen Camilla taking deep breaths behind him, clearly working to compose herself before facing her husband. The king's voice called out in response to Morrison's knock, and the captain opened the door with his usual precision. "Your Majesty," Morrison announced in his customary formal tone, "Her Majesty Queen Camilla requests an audience." From inside the study came the sound of papers being shuffled and the king's chair being pushed back from his desk. Morrison could sense the king's slight surprise at the unscheduled visit, but Charles's voice remained warm and welcoming as he called for his wife to enter. Morrison stepped aside to allow Queen Camilla to pass, their eyes meeting briefly as she moved past him into the study. In that brief moment of eye contact, Morrison saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. There was apology there, certainly, but also a kind of desperate vulnerability that made him understand, perhaps for the first time, the enormous pressures and constraints that shaped the lives of those he served. Queen Camilla was not just a royal figure in that moment, she was a human being struggling with emotions and circumstances that would challenge anyone. As the study door closed behind her, Morrison resumed his position in the corridor, his face once again composed in the neutral expression expected of a royal guard. The left side of his face still tingled slightly where her hand had connected, but he showed no sign of discomfort or distress. To any observer, he would have appeared exactly as he had an hour earlier, professional, alert, and completely in control. But, internally, Captain James Morrison was processing an experience that would fundamentally change his understanding of his role and responsibilities. The slap had lasted only a fraction of a second, but its implications would ripple through the coming days and weeks in ways that none of them could yet fully comprehend. He had made a choice to protect the institution he served, but he was beginning to understand that such protection might come at a personal cost that extended far beyond a momentary sting on his cheek. The palace around him continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred in one of its marble corridors. Inside the king's private study, the conversation between Charles and Camilla began with the usual pleasantries, but Morrison could sense through the thick oak doors that the atmosphere was far from normal. The king's voice carried its characteristic warmth, but there was an undertone of concern that suggested he was aware something was amiss with his wife. Years of marriage had given him an acute sensitivity to her moods, and the unscheduled nature of this meeting, combined with what he had heard in the corridor, had put him on high alert. Captain Morrison maintained his position outside the study, but his usual state of relaxed vigilance had been replaced by a heightened awareness of every sound and nuance from within the room. The conversation inside started quietly, but within minutes, voices began to rise. Queen Camilla's frustration, which had been building for weeks, finally found its outlet in angry words directed not at Morrison this time, but at the situation that had driven her to such unprecedented action. "The press is destroying us, Charles," her voice carried clearly through the door, no longer constrained by the usual royal composure. "Every day there's another story, another photograph, another attempt to undermine everything we've worked to build. And what do? We hide behind protocol and press releases while they tear us apart piece by piece." The king's response was measured and calm, but Morrison could detect the strain beneath his diplomatic tone. Charles had spent his entire life preparing for the crown, and the weight of maintaining the monarchy's dignity while managing very human problems was a burden that showed in every carefully chosen word. "Darling, we must maintain our composure. The crown has weathered storms before, and we will weather this one. Reacting emotionally will only give them more ammunition." Morrison shifted slightly, his military training making him acutely aware of the security implications of the raised voices. While the study was relatively private, sound could carry in the palace's grand spaces, and the last thing any of them needed was for this argument to be overheard by staff members who might later find themselves questioned by eager journalists. Queen Camilla's voice rose again, and Morrison could hear the desperation that had driven her to strike him just minutes earlier. "Composure? Charles, they're calling me a usurper, questioning my right to wear the crown. They're digging up every mistake I've ever made, every moment of weakness, and broadcasting it to the world. How much composure is enough? How much are we supposed to endure?" The pain in her voice was genuine and profound, and Morrison found himself reluctantly sympathetic despite the red mark still fading on his cheek. The life of a royal family member, particularly one who had not been born into the role, came with pressures and scrutiny that few people could truly understand. Every action was analyzed, every expression interpreted, every human moment magnified and judged by millions of people who felt entitled to opinions about lives they had never lived. Inside the study, King Charles was struggling with his own internal conflict between his duty as a monarch and his love for his wife. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with voices rising and falling as they worked through the complex web of personal emotion and public responsibility that defined their existence. Morrison heard chairs being moved, footsteps pacing across the Persian rug, and, at one point, what sounded very much like quiet crying. During this time, Morrison was acutely aware of the other palace staff going about their duties in nearby corridors. Twice, junior guards approached to deliver messages or reports, and Morrison handled these interactions with his usual professionalism while internally calculating the risk that someone might notice his heightened state of alert. The faint red mark on his cheek had faded enough to be unnoticeable in the palace's subdued lighting, but his posture and demeanor carried subtle signs of stress that a trained observer might detect. Lady Sarah Pemberton, the king's private secretary, approached near midday with a folder of documents requiring the king's immediate attention. Morrison knew that protocol dictated he should announce her presence and seek permission for her to interrupt the ongoing meeting, but the heated nature of the conversation inside made such an interruption potentially catastrophic. "Captain Morrison," Lady Sarah said in her crisp, efficient manner, "His Majesty needs to review these before his 2 o'clock appointment with the Archbishop." Morrison found himself in an impossible position. Interrupting the king and queen at this moment could expose their argument to additional witnesses, but failing to deliver urgent documents could compromise the king's schedule and responsibilities. The weight of his earlier decision to protect the royal family's privacy was now complicated by new dilemmas that his training had never prepared him to handle. "I'll ensure His Majesty receives the documents as soon as his current meeting concludes," Morrison replied, accepting the folder with steady hands while internally praying that his face betrayed nothing of the morning's events. Lady Sarah studied him with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to palace intrigue and the subtle signs of unusual circumstances. Morrison had worked with her for years, and he could see her noting the slight stiffness in his posture and the formal distance in his tone. She was too experienced and too intelligent to miss the signs that something significant was occurring, but she was also too professional to pry directly. "Is everything quite all right, Captain?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes probing. "Everything is proceeding according to protocol, Lady Sarah," Morrison responded, the practiced non-answer that palace staff used when discretion was paramount. The phrase meant nothing and everything simultaneously, confirming that she should not press for details while assuring her that the situation was being handled appropriately. After she left, Morrison realized that his morning's events had created ripple effects that would continue to complicate his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The slap had lasted seconds, but the need to maintain secrecy about it would require constant vigilance and careful management of every subsequent interaction. Inside the study, the conversation had shifted from anger to a more productive discussion of how to handle the ongoing crisis. Morrison could hear the king's voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when making decisions, and Queen Camilla's responses suggested they were working towards some kind of resolution or plan of action. "We need to control the narrative," the king was saying, his words clear enough for Morrison to follow the general direction of their discussion. "If we allow others to define us, we surrender the very authority that gives the crown its power." Queen Camilla's voice was calmer now, though Morrison could still detect the underlying tension that had driven her to such extremes earlier. "What do you propose? We can't simply ignore what's happening. The longer we remain silent, the more credence people give to their accusations." The strategic discussion that followed gave Morrison insight into the complexity of royal decision-making that he had never previously considered. Every public appearance, every statement, every gesture had to be carefully calculated for its potential impact not just on public opinion, but on the institution of monarchy itself. The personal cost of such scrutiny was something Morrison was only beginning to appreciate. As the afternoon wore on, Morrison found himself reflecting on the oath he had taken when he joined the Royal Guard. He had sworn to protect the royal family with his life, but he was discovering that protection could take forms he had never anticipated. Physical threats were straightforward, they could be met with training, weapons, and established protocols. But protecting the monarchy from scandal, from human frailty, from the consequences of emotional outbursts required a different kind of courage and a more nuanced understanding of duty. Near 2 o'clock, the study doors finally opened. King Charles emerged first, his face composed but showing the strain of the difficult conversation. He acknowledged Morrison with a slight nod, then turned back toward the door as Queen Camilla appeared. Her eyes were slightly red, suggesting tears had indeed been shed, but her bearing was once again regal and controlled. For a brief moment, Queen Camilla's eyes met Morrison's, and he saw in them a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude for his silence, regret for her actions, and, perhaps most surprisingly, a kind of respect for the way he had handled an impossible situation. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it established an understanding between them that would define their future interactions. "Captain Morrison," the king said, accepting the folder of documents that had been waiting for hours, "please ensure we're not disturbed for the next 30 minutes while I review these materials." "Of course, Your Majesty," Morrison replied, noting the subtle change in the king's manner that suggested he was aware something had occurred during the morning, even if he didn't know the specific details. As Queen Camilla walked away down the corridor, her posture once again perfect and her step confident, Morrison marveled at the transformation. The woman who had struck him in anger just hours before had reasserted complete control over her public persona. The skill required for such emotional compartmentalization was something Morrison found both impressive and deeply concerning. The remainder of Morrison's shift passed without incident, but he was acutely aware of the subtle changes in how other staff members interacted with him. Word had somehow spread, not about the slap itself, but about some kind of significant event involving Queen Camilla and the morning's unscheduled meeting. Palace staff were masters of reading between the lines and detecting the subtle shifts in atmosphere that signaled important developments. Morrison found himself fielding casual questions and observing closer scrutiny of his behavior throughout the afternoon. Each interaction required careful calibration to maintain the appearance of normalcy while protecting the secret that could potentially destroy reputations and damage the monarchy itself. As his shift ended and he prepared to brief his replacement, Morrison realized that the events of this single morning had fundamentally altered his role and responsibilities. He was no longer simply a guard protecting the physical safety of the royal family. He had become a keeper of secrets, a protector of reputations, and a guardian of institutional stability in ways that his original training had never anticipated. The weight of this new responsibility settled over him like a heavy cloak as he walked through the palace corridors toward the guards' quarters, knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh challenges and that the secret he now carried would require constant vigilance to maintain. The following morning brought an unusual tension to Buckingham Palace that Captain Morrison felt the moment he arrived for his shift. The normal rhythms of palace life seemed subtly altered, as if the building itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something momentous. Morrison had spent a restless night replaying the previous day's events, wrestling with questions about duty, loyalty, and the personal cost of protecting an institution larger than himself. As he took his position outside the king's study, Morrison noticed that the usual stream of early morning visitors and staff members seemed more subdued than normal. Conversations were conducted in lower voices, and there was a quality of careful attention in everyone's behavior that suggested significant developments were expected. The palace grapevine, that invisible network of information that flowed through the building with remarkable efficiency, was clearly carrying news of some importance. Lady Sarah Pemberton appeared earlier than usual, her arms filled with newspapers and briefing folders. Morrison observed her carefully as she approached, noting the tight set of her jaw and the quick, determined pace of her walk. These were signs he had learned to read during his years of service, indicators that the outside world was presenting new challenges that would require immediate attention and careful management. "Captain Morrison," she said briskly, "His Majesty will need absolute privacy this morning. No interruptions whatsoever unless it's a matter of national security." The unusual emphasis on privacy confirmed Morrison's suspicions that the previous day's events had set in motion a series of consequences that were now beginning to manifest. He accepted the instruction with his customary professionalism, but internally he was calculating the potential implications of such extraordinary security measures. Inside the study, Morrison could hear the king's voice, though the words were too muffled to understand. What was clear, however, was the tone, serious, authoritative, and carrying the weight of someone making decisions that would have far-reaching consequences. The conversation lasted for over an hour, with multiple phone calls and what sounded like a succession of different advisors joining and leaving the discussion. Near 10 o'clock, Queen Camilla approached the study with her usual retinue of ladies-in-waiting, but her manner was markedly different from the previous day. Where yesterday she had moved with the desperate energy of someone driven by anger and frustration, today she carried herself with the calculated composure of someone who had made difficult decisions and was prepared to face their consequences. As she drew closer, Morrison felt his muscles tense involuntarily. The memory of her hand connecting with his cheek was still fresh, and, despite his professional training, he found himself unconsciously preparing for potential conflict. But, when Queen Camilla's eyes met his, he saw something entirely different from the fire and desperation that had driven her actions the day before. "Captain Morrison," she said quietly, stopping directly in front of him, "I need to speak with my husband. But, first, I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with significance that extended far beyond a simple acknowledgement of inappropriate behavior. Morrison could see the cost of this admission in her face, the pride it had taken to voice it, the vulnerability it required to acknowledge her mistake, and the genuine regret that had clearly been weighing on her since the incident occurred. "Your Majesty," Morrison began, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Please, let me finish," she continued, her voice steady but carrying an emotional undertone that revealed the depth of her feelings. "What I did yesterday was inexcusable. You were performing your duties with the same professionalism and dedication you've shown for years, and I allowed my personal frustrations to override my judgment and my respect for you as an individual and as a servant of the crown. Morrison found himself in the unprecedented position of receiving a formal apology from a member of the royal family. The situation was so far outside normal protocol that he struggled to find an appropriate response. His training had prepared him for threats, emergencies, and complex security situations, but nothing had equipped him to handle this level of personal acknowledgement from someone he was sworn to protect. "I understand that what happened cannot be undone," Queen Camilla continued, "and I understand that you have chosen to handle this situation with a discretion and loyalty that goes far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect. I want you to know that your choice to protect the institution we both serve, despite the personal cost to yourself, is something I will never forget." The formality of her words could not disguise the genuine emotion behind them, and Morrison realized that this apology represented more than just personal regret. It was an acknowledgement of the complex relationship between the royal family and those who served them, and the human costs that sometimes resulted from the pressures of their unique positions. "Your Majesty," Morrison replied carefully, "serving the crown is both my honor and my duty. Yesterday's events are in the past, and my commitment to that service remains unchanged." Queen Camilla nodded slowly, and Morrison could see relief mixed with respect in her expression. The exchange had accomplished something important for both of them. It had acknowledged the breach of normal boundaries while reaffirming their commitment to the larger purposes they both served. "Thank you, Captain," she said simply, then moved past him toward the study doors. Morrison announced her arrival to the king, and, as the door closed behind her, he reflected on how profoundly different this encounter had been from the previous day's confrontation. The Queen's apology had not changed the fundamental facts of what had occurred, but it had transformed their relationship in ways that would influence all their future interactions. Inside the study, the conversation between the king and Queen began immediately and with obvious urgency. Morrison could hear papers being shuffled, phones ringing, and voices discussing what sounded like coordinated plans and strategic decisions. The tone was businesslike and focused, suggesting that whatever crisis management strategies they had developed were now being implemented. After about 30 minutes, the study door opened and several of the king's senior advisors filed out, their expressions grave and their manner suggesting they had just received instructions for tasks of considerable importance. Morrison recognized the Chancellor's private secretary, the press secretary's deputy, and two other officials whose specific roles he knew were related to crisis management and public communications. The implications were clear. Whatever had been set in motion by the previous day's events was now escalating into a full-scale response involving multiple levels of the palace hierarchy. Morrison realized that his decision to keep quiet about the slap had not eliminated the consequences of that moment, but had instead channeled them into directions that were potentially more complex and far-reaching than he had initially understood. Shortly before noon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the study, Archbishop Williams, whose presence at the palace outside of scheduled ceremonies or formal occasions was highly unusual. Morrison announced the Archbishop's arrival and observed the elderly man's serious demeanor as he entered the study. The presence of the church's highest representative suggested that the situation had developed dimensions that extended beyond simple crisis management into questions of moral and institutional significance. The meeting with the Archbishop lasted for over an hour, and, when he emerged, his expression was thoughtful and concerned. He paused to speak briefly with Morrison, an interaction that was both unexpected and revealing. "Captain Morrison," the Archbishop said quietly, "the burdens we carry in service to institutions larger than ourselves are sometimes heavier than we anticipate when we first accept them. I hope you know that such service, particularly when it requires personal sacrifice, is recognized and valued by those who understand its true cost." The words were carefully chosen, but Morrison understood their deeper meaning. Somehow, the Archbishop had been made aware of his situation and was offering both acknowledgement and support. The realization that knowledge of his silence was spreading among the highest levels of the establishment was both reassuring and troubling. As the afternoon progressed, Morrison noticed an increase in activity throughout the palace. Staff members moved with greater urgency, additional security personnel appeared at various checkpoints, and there was a general sense of preparation for significant events. The press office seemed particularly active, with numerous meetings and phone calls that suggested major announcements were being prepared. Late in the afternoon, Queen Camilla emerged from the study looking composed but showing signs of emotional exhaustion. She had spent hours in discussion with her husband and various advisors, clearly working through the implications of whatever decisions had been made. As she passed Morrison's position, she paused briefly. "Captain," she said quietly, "I want you to know that steps are being taken to ensure that the pressures that led to yesterday's incident will be properly addressed. The Crown must be stronger than any individual's moments of weakness, including my own." Morrison understood that she was telling him, in carefully diplomatic language, that comprehensive changes were being implemented to prevent future occurrences of the kind of stress and frustration that had driven her to strike him. The acknowledgement was both an additional apology and a commitment to institutional reform. As his shift neared its end, Morrison was approached by Colonel Richards, the commanding officer of the Royal Guard. The colonel's presence was always significant, but his serious expression suggested this was not a routine visit. "Morrison," the colonel said, "I need to speak with you privately. There are some matters that require discussion." Morrison followed the colonel to a private office, his mind racing through the possible reasons for this summons. The colonel's expression was unreadable, but Morrison could sense that this conversation would mark another turning point in his understanding of his role and responsibilities. "Captain," the colonel began once they were alone, "it has come to my attention that you handled a difficult situation yesterday with exceptional discretion and professionalism. While I don't need to know the specific details, I want you to understand that your loyalty and judgment have been noted at the highest levels." Morrison maintained his composure, but internally he was processing the implications of the colonel's words. It seemed that knowledge of his silence had reached even the military command structure, suggesting that the previous day's events had triggered a comprehensive review of security procedures and personnel reliability. "I also want you to know," the colonel continued, "that arrangements are being made to ensure your continued service to the Crown will be appropriately recognized and supported. Sometimes protecting the institution requires sacrifices that go unrecorded in official reports, but that doesn't mean they go unnoticed or unappreciated." The conversation concluded with Morrison understanding that his career trajectory had been fundamentally altered by his handling of Queen Camilla's assault. While the specific details of what had occurred would never appear in any official record, the consequences for his future would be significant and, apparently, positive. As Morrison left the palace that evening, he carried with him the knowledge that a single moment of crisis had transformed not only his own life but had triggered institutional responses that would reshape how the royal family managed stress, handled conflicts, and protected themselves from the human costs of their unique positions. The slap had lasted seconds, but its effects would ripple through the monarchy for years to come. 3 weeks after the incident that changed everything, Captain Morrison stood in the same corridor outside the king's study, but the world around him had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The palace operated with the same efficiency and protocol as always, but beneath the surface, significant changes had taken root that would define the monarchy for years to come. The most visible change was in Queen Camilla herself. The woman who had struck Morrison in a moment of desperate frustration had emerged from the crisis with a renewed sense of purpose and a markedly different approach to her role. The anger and defensive posture that had characterized her behavior for months had been replaced by a quiet confidence and a more strategic engagement with the challenges facing the crown. Morrison had watched this transformation with professional interest and personal reflection. The Queen's public appearances had taken on a new quality. She seemed more relaxed, more genuinely engaged with the people she met, and more willing to address difficult questions directly rather than hiding behind diplomatic language. The press had noticed the change too, with several commentators noting that she appeared to have found her footing as queen in ways that had previously eluded her. The institutional changes were equally significant, though less visible to public observers. A new position had been created within the palace hierarchy, Director of Royal Wellbeing, tasked with monitoring and addressing the psychological pressures faced by members of the royal family. The role was filled by Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a respected psychologist with extensive experience in trauma and stress management for high-profile individuals. Morrison had been briefed on these changes by Colonel Richards, who explained that the new protocols were designed to prevent the kind of emotional crisis that had led to the slap. Regular counseling sessions, stress management programs, and more structured approaches to handling media criticism were now mandatory for all senior royals. The changes represented a recognition that serving the crown required not just public dedication but personal support systems that had previously been absent. The king himself had undergone his own transformation during these weeks. Morrison had observed Charles during dozens of meetings and public appearances, and there was a new gravity to his bearing that suggested the incident with his wife had forced him to confront aspects of royal life that he had previously managed to ignore or delegate to others. The king's conversations with his advisors now included regular discussions of family well-being and the personal costs of public service. On this particular morning, Morrison was expecting a visit from an investigative journalist who had been granted a rare private interview with the king. The session was part of a broader public relations strategy designed to address the ongoing crisis that had triggered Queen Camilla's breakdown 3 weeks earlier. The palace had decided to take a more proactive approach to media relations, acknowledging problems directly rather than allowing speculation to fill the vacuum of official silence. James Patterson of the Times was known for his thorough preparation and his ability to ask difficult questions in ways that subjects found hard to evade. Morrison had been briefed on Patterson's background and his likely approach to the interview. The journalist had built his reputation on exposing institutional failures and personal hypocrisies among the powerful, but he also had a record of fairness when dealing with subjects who were genuinely committed to reform and transparency. As Patterson arrived at the palace, Morrison observed him with the analytical eye he had developed for assessing potential threats. The journalist was younger than expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with the alert, skeptical bearing of someone accustomed to uncovering uncomfortable truths. His manner was professional but not deferential. He clearly understood the significance of his access to the king while maintaining the independence necessary for credible journalism. "Mr. Patterson," Morrison said, performing his customary security check and identity verification, "His Majesty is expecting you. I'll need to examine your recording equipment and personal items before you enter the study." Patterson submitted to the security procedures with good humor, understanding that such measures were standard practice for any interaction with the royal family. As Morrison conducted the routine checks, he found himself wondering how much the journalist knew about the royal dynamics within the palace and whether his questions would probe into areas that might threaten the carefully maintained secrecy about recent events. Inside the study, King Charles was reviewing his notes for the interview with the same careful preparation he brought to all his public engagements. The decision to grant this level of access to a serious journalist represented a significant shift in palace strategy, and the king understood that his responses would be scrutinized not just by Patterson but by millions of readers who would form opinions about the monarchy based on this conversation. Morrison announced Patterson's arrival and stood aside as the journalist entered the study. Through the partially open door, Morrison could hear the initial pleasantries that preceded any formal interview, but he was struck by the king's tone, warm but serious, welcoming but alert to the potential implications of every word. The interview lasted for nearly 2 hours, during which Morrison maintained his position in the corridor while internally processing the fragments of conversation that reached his ears. The discussion covered a wide range of topics, from the king's vision for the future of the monarchy to his personal reflections on the challenges of public service in the modern world. What struck Morrison most forcefully was the king's willingness to acknowledge difficulty and uncertainty rather than maintaining the traditional royal stance of confident certainty. Charles spoke openly about the pressures faced by his family, the need for institutional adaptation, and his own ongoing learning process as he grew into his role as monarch. The honesty was refreshing but also risky, as any sign of weakness or uncertainty could be used by critics to question the monarchy's relevance and effectiveness. Near the end of the interview, Morrison heard Patterson ask a question that made him tense with concern. "Your Majesty, there have been reports of increased stress within the royal household in recent months. How do you respond to suggestions that the pressures of modern monarchy may be taking a personal toll on your family?" The question was carefully worded but clearly designed to probe into exactly the areas that Morrison's silence was meant to protect. The king's response was measured and thoughtful, acknowledging the reality of stress while avoiding any specific details that might compromise palace security or family privacy. "The role of the monarchy in contemporary society requires constant adaptation," Charles replied, his voice clear and steady. "We are not immune to the pressures that face any family in positions of public responsibility, but we are committed to addressing those pressures in ways that strengthen both our personal well-being and our service to the nation." Morrison recognized the diplomatic skill in the response. It acknowledged the journalist's premise without providing any specific information that could be used to construct damaging narratives. The king had learned to navigate these conversations with the same strategic thinking that he applied to constitutional matters and international relations. When the interview concluded, Patterson emerged from the study with the satisfied expression of someone who had gathered material for a significant story. Morrison watched the journalist carefully as he prepared to leave, noting his professional manner but also his obvious appreciation for the access he had been granted. "Captain Morrison," Patterson said as he gathered his equipment, "I hope you know that your service to this institution is both recognized and respected. The dedication required to maintain the dignity and security of the Crown often goes unnoticed by the public, but it doesn't go unappreciated by those who understand its importance." The comment was unexpected and suggested that Patterson had a deeper understanding of palace dynamics than his questions during the interview had revealed. Morrison wondered if the journalist had somehow become aware of recent events, but Patterson's manner suggested respect rather than the pursuit of scandal. After Patterson's departure, Morrison was summoned to a brief meeting with the king. These one-on-one conversations were rare and typically indicated matters of particular significance. As Morrison entered the study, he noted that Charles appeared both tired and satisfied, as if the interview had been challenging but successful. "Captain Morrison," the king began, "I wanted to thank you personally for your discretion and professionalism during a difficult period. The way you handled recent challenges has been exemplary, and I want you to know that your service has not gone unnoticed." Morrison maintained his professional posture, but internally he was moved by the personal nature of the king's acknowledgement. The monarch rarely spoke directly to individual guards about their performance, and the fact that he was doing so now indicated the significance of Morrison's role in protecting the royal family's reputation and stability. "More importantly," Charles continued, "I want you to know that steps have been taken to ensure that the kind of situation you faced will not occur again. The well-being programs we've implemented are designed to provide better support for all members of our family, and new protocols are in place to handle stress and conflict in more constructive ways." The king's words confirmed what Morrison had observed over the previous weeks, that his silence about Queen Camilla's assault had not simply covered up a problem but had created space for genuine institutional reform. The changes that had resulted were comprehensive and sustainable, addressing root causes rather than merely managing symptoms. As Morrison left the study, he reflected on how profoundly his life and understanding of his role had changed since that morning 3 weeks earlier when Queen Camilla's hand had connected with his cheek. The slap had lasted only seconds, but its consequences had reshaped the monarchy's approach to family well-being, media relations, and crisis management in ways that would benefit the institution for generations. Later that afternoon, Morrison received word that he was being reassigned to a new position within the Royal Guard, Senior Captain for Family Security, a role that would give him broader responsibilities for protecting the personal safety and privacy of all members of the royal family. The promotion represented recognition not just of his discretion during the recent crisis, but of his deeper understanding of the complex human dynamics that shaped life within the monarchy. As his first shift in the new position began, Morrison walked through the palace corridors with a different perspective on his role and responsibilities. He was no longer simply a guard protecting against external threats, he was a guardian of the institution itself, tasked with preserving the delicate balance between public service and private humanity that made the monarchy both vulnerable and resilient. Queen Camilla passed him in the corridor near the end of his shift, accompanied by her new well-being advisor and moving with the confident stride of someone who had found her footing after a period of profound difficulty. As she drew near, she paused to acknowledge Morrison with a slight nod and a smile that conveyed both gratitude and respect. "Good evening, Senior Captain," she said, using his new title for the first time. "I trust your new responsibilities are proving rewarding." "Indeed they are, Your Majesty," Morrison replied, understanding that this brief exchange represented the full-circle completion of a crisis that had transformed them both. As Morrison watched her continue down the corridor, he realized that the slap that had changed everything had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the institution they both served. The moment of human frailty had led to institutional growth, personal understanding, and a deeper appreciation for the complex balance between duty and humanity that defined service to the crown. The palace around him continued its ancient rhythms, but Morrison now understood that beneath the surface of protocol and tradition, it was ultimately the human choices made in moments of crisis that determined the monarchy's survival and success. His choice to remain silent about a moment of weakness had created space for growth, reform, and a stronger foundation for the future. The weight of secrets would always be part of his burden, but Morrison now understood that such weight was not a liability but a responsibility, one that connected him to centuries of loyal service and to the ongoing project of preserving an institution that was larger than any individual moment or failure. As he prepared to end his shift and brief his replacement, Morrison carried with him the knowledge that the most important moments in service to the crown often occurred not in grand ceremonies or public appearances, but in quiet corridors where human frailty and institutional loyalty intersected in ways that would shape history for generations to come.